Hello and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. So this is the second part of a brief history of Tchaikovsky. So if you missed the first part, definitely check that video out first, because in that video we talk about Tchaikovsky's early days, and I think if you don't see that one, this one's not going to make nearly as much sense. So in today's video, we are going to talk about his later years and his death. So let's get started. A part of his growing fame had to do with the author Dostoevsky, who made a speech in favor of universal unity. At the time, Russians weren't a big fan of Russian music that wasn't distinctly Russian sounding. Tchaikovsky's fusion of Western styles wasn't really appreciated by everyone. But as soon as Dostoevsky made this speech, Russians became much more accepting of Tchaikovsky's diverse, kind of international sounding music. During this time, 1881, he wrote the famous 1812 Overture, but Tchaikovsky didn't particularly love it. He wrote to Nadezhda, "It is very loud and noisy, but I wrote it with no warm feeling of love, and therefore there will probably be no artistic merits in it." Also in 1881, he composed his famous piano trio in A minor, dedicated to his mentor Nikolai Rubinstein, who had recently died. This composition was hugely popular nowadays and in his lifetime. In the mid-1880s, Tchaikovsky started to crave a change of pace from all of the travel and social isolation that he'd been experiencing. He wanted to settle down and have a home. It was also at this time that he was considered to be the premier court composer in St. Petersburg, and he was in with the Tsar Alexander III, so he had a very high social standing at this point in his life. He then settled down in the countryside. His new place had easy access to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and Tchaikovsky enjoyed some peace and quiet, walking in the forest, reading, and playing cards or music with friends in the evening. Tchaikovsky became even more involved in promoting Russian music, despite not loving the socialite life. He started conducting Russian music and did some touring as a conductor. He conducted his own premiere, his Fifth Symphony, in 1888. He toured to many cities, including Berlin, Prague, Paris, and London, where he had the opportunity to meet other well-known composers like Brahms, Grieg, and Dvorak. And it was his newfound fondness of conducting that also brought him to the United States in 1891, where he led the orchestra in his Festival Coronation March. His famous Sleeping Beauty ballet was created and performed during this time period in 1890, as well as The Queen of Spades, which was an opera, and it received mixed reviews, as did a lot of his compositions, but Tchaikovsky himself maintained that the music from it was among some of the best in the world of opera. He really had a high opinion of this one. And then, of course, from the same era is his famous ballet, The Nutcracker. It was also around this time that Nadezhda ran out of money and was unable to continue supporting Tchaikovsky financially. This was a major blow to him, not only for losing the money, but also for losing her friendship, since they also ceased correspondence at that point. Nevertheless, he toured and traveled. So in 1893, he was awarded an honorary doctorate in music from the University of Cambridge. At this point, Tchaikovsky was considered to be one of the world's greatest composers. Because of his fame and success, he had a really packed schedule and was in demand everywhere. So his new symphony, Symphony Number 6, was premiered for the end of October 1893. He had performance dates scheduled all across Europe, in Moscow, in Paris, in St. Petersburg, in London. But before he got to do all of this, he died. Just 9 short days after the premiere of the Pathétique Symphony, which was his 6th symphony, he fell ill and died in St. Petersburg at the age of 53. He died officially of, air quotes, we'll talk more about his death in a moment. He died officially of cholera, which was a public endemic at the time in Russia. His funeral was held on November 9th, 1893, and the capacity for this funeral was 6,000 people, but they actually crammed 8,000 people in because so many people wanted to visit, and actually there were 60,000 people who applied for tickets, so only a small amount of people who wanted to visit his funeral service were able to, but still a lot of people. Historians have been arguing about Tchaikovsky's death for decades. Was it as simple as him contracting cholera, or was there something else going on, like suicide? So I want to briefly go over some of the various theories that people have on Tchaikovsky's death and you can come to your own conclusions because no one really knows. Okay, so the official cholera theory goes that Tchaikovsky ordered a glass of unboiled water at a restaurant because apparently they couldn't boil water or something like that. This was a really unusual thing to do at a time when there was a cholera endemic, and predictably, he contracted cholera and died about a week later. This story is kind of unusual, and Tchaikovsky was known for having a history of really good personal hygiene, and that's one of the big reasons that have led people to speculate on other causes of his death. So another common theory is that Tchaikovsky committed suicide. This idea is supported by the fact that his Sixth Symphony, the Pathetique Symphony, almost seems like a requiem of his own death, almost like a funeral, almost like a suicide note, because it's really, really dark and disturbing. And apparently it was so moving to the audience when he performed it originally, when he first conducted it, that the audience was in tears. So why would Tchaikovsky have killed himself? It's thought that maybe he was really unhappy about not being able to pursue relationships with the people he really loved because homosexuality was frowned upon in Russia. It actually wasn't like punishable by death or anything like that, but it wasn't like something you could just be open about at the time. So maybe his depression could have sprung from that. But there's so many letters that have been saved of Tchaikovsky's, and in none of these letters can you really find any proof that he was under more severe mental duress than a typical person. Like, he had his ups and downs and he had his swings, but nothing in his letters implied that he was suicidal before this point. So that's why this theory can never really be confirmed. Another alternate theory is that Tchaikovsky did get cholera, but he didn't contract it from drinking the water. He contracted it from visiting a man of the night. There's no real proof of this, but it kind of helps make the story of Tchaikovsky ordering unboiled water make more sense, because if he had contracted it from a man of the night, he wouldn't want anyone to know about it. So if he had caught cholera, he knew he was sick, then maybe it would go to make sense that he would go to elaborate lengths to stage a fake way of contracting cholera. So moving on from Tchaikovsky's death, let's spend a minute talking about his music. We've already talked about a variety of his famous compositions in these videos, such as the ballets, Sleeping Beauty, and the Nutcracker. One of the things that I find remarkable about Tchaikovsky is the diverse range of mood and emotion that you can find across all of his works, whether they're symphonic, whether they are solo piano, whether they're smaller ensembles or whatever. His music really spans a diverse range of feeling. He was also essentially the first full-time Russian composer and one of the first really renowned Eastern composers to become popular in Western music's landscape. He brought Eastern and Western styles together in a way that no one before had, but in a way that was also uniquely his own sound. Tchaikovsky was a huge influence on other Russian composers that followed him as well, such as the fairly well-known Stravinsky. If you ever want to hear the sound of Tchaikovsky's actual voice, there's a short little clip of him in conversation that you can find all over the internet. Apparently, he didn't want to be recorded, though. When asked if he wanted to, say, play piano or say something to the recorder, he replied, "I am a bad pianist and my voice is raspy. Why should one eternalize it?" As far as Tchaikovsky's personality goes, we do know that he was very introverted, but he did tolerate the company of people pleasantly enough. Like, he wasn't like running away from social situations. Apparently, he wrote in his diary that he could carry on animated conversations with people, but would rather flee from them to the ends of the world. He did have a few close friends and family members that he was fiercely devoted to throughout his entire life, including his brother Modest. Tchaikovsky was also a little bit of a perfectionist and was known to tear up his own works if they were not to his high standards of quality. And he also had a lot of faith and belief in himself as a composer, even though the world didn't always agree. Tchaikovsky spent his life getting polarized reviews from people, but he always had a really good intrinsic sense that what he was doing was valuable. In general, I don't really subscribe to the notion that Tchaikovsky was this two-dimensional character who was always super depressed and stuff like that. I think that he had a lot more complexity than that, and he definitely experienced ups and downs and highs and lows in life, and he was almost definitely tortured by the reality of his sexuality, but I don't think that any of these manifested in mental illness that some people tend to think. Ultimately, I think that Tchaikovsky came to be quite comfortable with who he was as a person. His music doesn't just sound depressing. His music also shows a lot of highs in life. There's a lot of energy and vitality in a significant portion of his writings. So I think that Tchaikovsky in general was just a pretty well-rounded human being. And that wraps up our discussion on the history of Tchaikovsky. So hopefully you enjoyed the series. Maybe you learned something new about a composer that maybe you didn't know a lot about. And I urge you to check out Tchaikovsky's music. We've done a video on the music of Tchaikovsky before, so that could be a good launching point to explore his music if you haven't already. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next video. He apparently once referred to Mozart as the musical Christ. See, that part was like irrelevant to what I was talking about, but I read it because it was there. We learned that he thought Wagner's Ring Cycle was cool, but the music was... Ugh. Sorry, I gotta start that again.